Hmm.
Now, often, my observation of people who call themselves sensitive people is there are two types. There are basically people who have a sensitivity that's natural to them, and there are people who have a sensitivity which is incurred as a result of growing up in some kind of abusive situation where they were constantly either bombarded with something or abused or unable to feel safe. Here's the news, folks. The news is there's no place of safety. Safety, security, those are some of the myths of Western civilization. Make enough
I'm
money.
Dean Walker, and welcome to the Poetry of Predicament podcast, a podcast for people brave enough to face humanity's challenges and problems, and most importantly, our numerous predicaments. The Poetry of Predicament is a podcast meant to inspire us to bring forth grace, beauty, and connection with the web of life in the face of a predicament-laden world. This week on the Poetry of Predicament podcast, we welcome back Dr. Peter Nelson, who's a substantial practicing psychologist in Australia. And for the purposes of our conversation here, even more importantly, he is a long-standing seer, someone who sees in unusual ways, has a remarkable ability to perceive what others often cannot. So let's welcome Dr. Peter Nelson. Welcome back to another episode of the Poetry of Predicament podcast. I am your ever-present host, Dean Walker, and really pleased to be here once again with my good buddy, Dr. Peter Nelson. Just a remarkable mentor and advisor and buddy for quite a few years now, and this is another in a series of interviews that I believe we started last year. And Peter, you probably noticed by now that I've had a leaning, and I've been pretty open about it, I think. And the leaning is the folks that are tracking with this series of interviews with you. I don't think any of them would call themselves a seer, that they just don't have that innate skill, and they haven't been trained, but they do consider themselves perhaps this, the term, highly sensitive person, or they are able to access non-ordinary perception at some level in some part of their lives. And so they're able to relate to certain pieces that we've both been, through my leaning on questions that take you in that direction, and your, just ample responses. I think you're giving us, at whatever level somebody's sensitivities or non-ordinary perception might be, you're giving us a few hints here and there, a few practices, a few things we can shift about how we deploy our attention, and I call them also desaturating practices that could allow more of our intent and more of our attention to be utilized. Because we've talked, I've lost count of how many times we've talked about just the bombardment that our attention is subject to in regular life. It's just insane. So today is similar. I have some similar questions for you, and just to give you the kind of overarching theme, it's I'm still on the theme of how can we offer up practices, suggestions for people to expand their capacity to be present as that
mm,
saturation and that intense predation of our attention is going on more and more. I'm pretty clear it's not going to slow down anytime soon.
mm, mm.
And
No,
so,
obviously not.
yeah. And so I'm just that's the overarching theme is from your Seer's perspective, what are some of the ways that we can again deploy our attention in a more coherent way? How can we expand our capacity to be present in the face of that kind of predation and
Mm,
onslaught? And then I'd also love to hear whatever you might share about, the Paul Richards, who was the guy that introduced me to you, and along with all the other folks, the Sente folks in the Southern Oregon and elsewhere. Um, he really made a quite a point of sharing what he sees about the energetic realm, and my way of kind of summarizing what he would be sharing. He never said it this way, but this is just how I put it together out of what he said, is if we're playing ping pong in daily life, and this is the ups and downs and the tribulations and so on of daily life, that energetically underneath that ping pong table is bowling balls going back and forth and bashing us in the legs, while the ping
mm,
pong
mm,
game is what we talk about, what we share about, what we're consciously aware of. And I'd
mm,
love to hear
mm,
your response to that. I don't know how accurate
mm.
that is in your experience, how useful it is, or if you'd say it differently. So I think that's plenty
It's a
to get you started.
metaphor that
Yeah, yeah,
it's a
that's all.
metaphor that you could use. It's probably not one I would use, but it does sum up part of it. Think of it, I've been watching a whole lot of Japanese films. And one of the things that Japanese filmmakers love are these sudden downpour storms. They love wind, like, Kurosawa will have Toshiro Mifune in one of his famous roles, going down the main street to, have the showdown with he's the samurai, he's going to have the showdown with the Yakuza, the gangsters.
Mhm.
And, he's got this wind blowing through the scene and there's a wind whipping around. And in a way, he's trying to create a contrast between the turbulence of the feelings and everything going on around this fight, and then the stillness of the samurai who's facing this horde, but
Mhm.
he's facing it with a kind of clear, focused determination.
Mhm.
But the thing they always use are these sudden downpours. So what happens in a sudden downpour? If you get caught in a sudden downpour, well, if you have an umbrella, you pull it out, you put your umbrella up, but a gust of wind pulls the umbrella and just wrecks it, and so you start running not to get drenched, right? And in the end, you get drenched anyway, and you start fussing about the fact of how wet you are. And this is what it's like to live in the world and the kind of energy that is around us all the time. It's like a downpour. Uh, and you have two ways of meeting that downpour. You can meet it like as a kind of a person in a panic trying to escape it so you don't get wet, or you accept that you get wet or the wind blowing down the street
Mhm.
and you just remain steadfast in the middle of that.
Mhm.
And it the thing about human beings is they don't dissolve in the rain. And and this is one of the things that sensitive people uh, are trying to actually protect themselves all the time in ways that don't really work, because what they try to do is get out of the rain and stay out of the rain. But the rain is so prevalent now. It's just everywhere. It's just all around us all the time. And so you can't get out of the rain. So if you stop trying to get out of the rain and you stop resisting the rain and just know that you're not going to dissolve, because human beings don't dissolve in rainstorms, that you just remain centered and focused in the middle of that, because there's no escape from it. The only thing you can do is be centered and quiet and focused in the middle of it. And therefore, it won't change you internally. It won't dissolve you. What most people are doing when they're fighting this or trying to escape it is they're self-dissolving. The rain won't dissolve you, but you dissolve yourself. And you dissolve yourself by letting your center evaporate and not seeing yourself as having an agency which can remain focused and steadfast in the middle of the storm. And that's what needs development. Another way of putting it in Western terms is resilience. We're not building resilience, we're building kind of a fortress to try to, offset the fact that we don't feel resilient. We can't respond to this and be steadfast in the middle of it. And so my advice is, don't focus on your, whatever you call your sensitivity. Focus on how to be centered and present in the middle of whatever the storm is. Now, often, my observation of people who call themselves sensitive people is there are two types. There are basically people who have a sensitivity that's natural to them, and there are people who have a sensitivity which is incurred as a result of growing up in some kind of abusive situation where they were constantly either bombarded with something or abused or unable to feel safe. Here's the news, folks. The news is there's no place of safety. Safety, security, those are some of the myths of Western civilization. Make enough money, you'll be secure. No, you could walk into the Louisville bank at the moment the gunman is in there and be shot dead. There is no safety, there is no security. That doesn't mean you act in a brazenly stupid way by taking ridiculous risks, but it does mean you don't act like the world is constantly on fire and you're running because you're going to be burned up. The world's not literally on fire, it's a downpour, and you won't dissolve. And if you learn to be steadfast and focused in the middle of that, you can manage it in ways you never dreamt possible. But you have to develop resilience, you have to develop steadfastness, you have to develop centeredness. And to do that, you also have to develop an attention which is broadly open to what's going on around you. So you're aware of it, you're paying attention to it, but somehow you've learned to not let the rain set you into a panic. I'm going to put it in other terms. One of the things as a psychologist, I always have had an interest in evolutionary psychology. And I've talked about the sambar deer before. These are the deer in East India that tigers predate on. One guy told a mutual friend of ours, Dick Craig, that sambar deer are tiger snacks. The tigers, live off them. It's quite often. So you see a herd of sambar deer, and they're always ready to be on alert. The slightest noise in the underbrush, and their ears go up, and their nose goes up, and they're sniffing the air.
Mm-hmm.
That's what we're like still. We're basically reactors in a herd waiting for the predator. And if there is a genuine predator, run. Maybe don't run in front of a bear because they'll chase you, but do what's necessary to protect yourself. But I'm not talking about physical threats. I'm talking about the storm, the intensity of emotional, psychic, energetic fields that are just going all the time around us. There's
Right.
just a constant drain on our systems from that. And by the way, another important thing is get off social media, which is like saying, don't watch my videos, but
Right.
or limit your social media. Limit it, stop. One of the reasons social media works so well, that part of our brains in the limbic system that goes into alert when there's any kind of sense of threat, it's being activated all the time by social media. Your feed on Facebook or Instagram or any of those services is constantly either alerting you to danger or alerting you to potential pleasure.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're spending all your time being alerted, having your, kind of limbic system lit up like a volcano,
Mm-hmm.
then it's impossible to be centered.
Mm-hmm.
So you want to minimize your contact with that. And you want to also learn to look at something in your feed that's going, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. And you go, I don't care.
Right.
That it has no effect on you. So it's that reaction, that alert system that is built into all of us that comes down to us through evolution,
Mm-hmm.
which we have to learn to not constantly activate it by either putting ourselves in the position where we're activating it or just being ready to have it activated. How do you actually calm it down?
Mm-hmm.
Well, meditation is a good practice, but it's not necessary. It's a good practice. I recommend it to anyone, but it's like you have to go around practicing being still no matter where you are.
Mm-hmm.
You're in the supermarket and it's crowded. Can you be still and just notice everything going on around you as just the
Yeah.
whirl of sensation going on around you? That's the key to the whole thing.
Okay.
Because if you want to be a sensitive person, great, the sensitivity is terrific. But if you act as if the sensitivity is something which drives you into hiding or running all the time, then it's not terrific.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to learn how to be sensitive, but be unperturbed by your sensitivity. Okay, I'm done.
Okay, well, thank you. That's a strong foundation for perhaps the next couple of questions will be just small fragments that we can place on top of that.
Mm-hmm.
So I have a question from a listener.
Mm-hmm.
What I heard you just describing was the ambient chaos, a relative chaos of that the distraction, the social media, just the cacophony 24/7, which in my listening, that lacks a collective intent. There's not like a binding force that brings all that energy together and focuses it in some sort of detrimental way that this now 10-ton gorilla could just smash, energetically just smash a person. So that would be a whole different kind of threat and a whole different
Okay,
thing to be
but
attentive
it
to.
does have a net effective intent uh, in terms of the way people are reacting to it.
Mm-hmm. I guess my question is either at the scale of walking down the street and getting a sense of an energetic pulse of some kind that really communicates a threat, like gets your attention, like what the hell was that? Or I better, I just want to bring my attention there and find out what that is. So on that kind of individual to
Yeah,
individual level, and then
yeah, yeah.
I'd also like to talk about if there is any sort of ambient, larger scale intent that actually has a coherence to it, actually has some kind of directedness to it.
Okay, let me talk about walking down the street, and
Sure.
let's say there's some kind of, you know, kind of violent activity going on you see starting up. If you're in the attention of a seer, you get the impact of that instantly. But what you don't do, and this you learn to do growing up in New York City, which I did,
Mm-hmm.
uh, is if you then focus on it, you've added your intent
Mm-hmm.
to what's going on,
Yeah.
and you've actually just invited yourself in. So that violence can then spread to you as well. It won't
Mm-hmm.
necessarily, but you have a greater chance of it happening. A seer registers stuff like that, but will take his attention off of it, not to be engaged in it, not to live in it, not to become part of it. So
Mm-hmm.
that's a real difference. Noticing and engaging are two different things.
Mm-hmm.
People do it as one motion, so they think it's one thing, noticing and engaging. But noticing is, there's think of it as a perturbation in the force. You either move toward it or away from it.
There's a third option that I'm curious about. That would be what if my reaction was to get a sense of this pulse, this presence, and to armor up, to somehow shield myself or try and armor up in the face of it.
Well, there is no armor you can wear that can stop certain things. Uh, I mean, unless you're wearing, a very high level flak jacket, you can't armor up against bullets,
Right.
and you
Yeah.
can't armor up against, uh, energetic intent. And what I'm saying is your first action is not to connect it to you,
Mm-hmm.
is to notice it without connecting it to yourself.
Right. And it
And
seems like
armor's
is
not required.
armoring seems like an intensified way that I'm actually feeding energy into that system uh,
Yes,
at the
that's
highest
exactly
level
what
that
I
we've
was
talked about.
describing.
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's exactly what I was describing.
Okay,
Armoring up is engaging it and getting ready for the
right.
blow. I mean, but even, in martial arts, good martial artists don't armor up waiting for the blow. They
Right,
become fluid waiting for the blow,
right.
because that way they can move away from it or towards it in a way that where they can counter it, but
Mm-hmm,
they're not armoring up. Armoring up is freezing.
mm-hmm,
If when the tiger is in the underbrush and you're a sambar deer and you freeze, you're dinner.
mm-hmm.
Uh,
Yeah,
if you run too soon, you're dinner.
that's right.
Because then you separate from the pack.
Yes.
You know, your best
Mm-hmm,
chance of not being dinner is running just at the right moment.
mm-hmm,
But if you are constantly wired up to be ready to run and anything triggers you, well, you won't solve the problem of being a sensitive person in a world bombarding you all the time.
Right, right. Really clear. Really clear. Thank you. So, sorry. Just one more piece on that kind of larger scale presence or larger scale intent. I'm curious if there's, in your experience, are there times when you've gotten a sense of an ambient or a larger scale presence or intent that really, whether or not it had pleasant or positive attributes to it, or some sort of threatening or some sort of invasive, unwelcome, invasive intent to it. Have you had that kind of experience, and can you describe it if you have?
Yeah. I mean, let's take a more pleasant one first. Yeah,
Okay.
I was in San Francisco through the '60s, and before Woodstock ever happened, there was an event in San Francisco that became the model for it, which happened, I think, in January '67. And it was a very mild winter, so that it was sunny and in the '70s out. And everyone gathered in Golden Gate Park for the first human being.
Right,
And
right.
a lot of the bands were there: Country Joe and the Fish, Janis Joplin, Big Brother and the Holding Company, the Quicksilver Messenger Service, all
Mm-hmm.
these groups there. The music, it was all free, and everyone was hanging around, just enjoying the, how should I say, the tribal ambience of
Mm-hmm.
a tribal gathering.
Oh yeah.
And then someone parachuted into the middle of it, and it became a kind of a marker event. And it was all, but you could feel the whole group created, this intention of creating a sense of enjoyment and being together and
Yeah.
kind
Yeah.
of resonating to the music. Uh, Now, if you want to see a negative event, just look at the films of the Nuremberg rallies in the 1930s that Hitler was running.
Mm.
You'll see it, or look at you know people in groups. For instance, the Virginia March, where they were all going around with kind of these tiki lamps,
Mm-hmm.
pretending to be from the 1930s.
Mm.
Uh, you could see that they're trying to create a sort of a particular type of intent or intentionality. They're attempting to do that. I think in history, though, it happens within countries or parts of the world where that does happen. And, I think the Nuremberg rallies really are a product of that, where you see, if you look at the film and don't judge it, just look at it,
Mm.
it's the fervent, participation, the absolute, uh, I guess you would call it, you know, ecstasy that people are experiencing.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Part of that's causing that is their engagement, their connection to the intentionality of the bigger movement, which was, you know, countrywide at that
Mm-hmm.
point. So yeah. Now I tended to avoid situations like that
Mm-hmm.
because when people are caught up in them, because I'm a seer, I don't get caught up in them because I'm always actually looking at how the energy is working. And when you're actually seeing it that way, it doesn't actually have an effect on you. It's
Right.
like you're in the rain getting wet, but you're not melting. Whereas if you're not seeing it through the eyes of centered awareness, then you're blending in, you're melting into the general energetic flow. So, but when I've been around them, and I have, it's basically, unless you're fairly advanced in how you actually deploy your attention, it's very easy to get sucked in. And I think a lot of people at January 6th, that you watch that crowd sort of self-making itself. It was creating itself. It was, building and increasing in intensity as it built. And people engage that. But I would say the people most engaged were either people manipulating it, trying to add to it consciously, which there were some, but mainly there were people who were just, maybe the overall beliefs of that crowd were their beliefs, but they were being fought by the energetic flux that was being created. And it was magnifying. You could see it magnifying as time went on. But again, there's no armor. The armor is just actually, it's like, if a leech lands on your skin, you just pick it up and throw it off. If you start running and screaming, the leeches won't go away, but you'll still end up with a leech on you. So it's the way you use your attention to actually see how it's trying to engage you, and then just not engaging with it, just not reacting. Again, there's a part of your brain that is easily activated, and the amygdala of the limbic system easily goes into a kind of reaction mode, seeing danger, seeing threat, etc. But if you're centered and you're aware, it actually literally prevents that part of your limbic system from firing, because it requires, you have to let it sort of fire. But once it fires and you're caught by it, unless you're very well trained, it's hard to come out of it until it's over. And, various psychophysiological textbooks I've seen say when that gets activated, it takes about, from the time you stop being engaged, takes about 20 minutes, maybe even up to an hour before the whole thing calms down of its own accord.
Right.
So the most important thing is not to get the reaction system going, to use your attention to see what's happening and not engage the reaction system, so that you can make a choice as to whether you go right or left, or to the back or to the front or wherever.
Right. I just let me know if ever I'm going too far down a track and you're kind of done with it, but I'm curious. My experience in these past 10 years, and particularly in the past 5 or so, is that a significant portion of the U.S. public is constantly triggered beyond the level that you're describing. It was already half baked, so to speak, when they got to January 6th, because they were fed 24/7 Fox News and so on. It just the constant hyping and the fear and the anger and the fear and the anger and so on.
Right. They arrived that way, but for that group to really coalesce the way it did, it had to go to another level. It's really, before then, it's always the tiger, which is a ways away. But when you're at the January 6th event, you're reacting as if the tiger is right there. And so you go into full fight or flight mode. And there's nothing much more I can say about it, except that the way you use your attention will determine how you respond to that sort of situation,
Mm-hmm.
to how you react, to whether
Yeah.
you react to it much at all.
Yeah.
Uh, but that takes a bit of training, though,
Sure.
and it's not something. And I agree with Paul's metaphor of, it looks like human interactions look like it's a kind of a nice game of ping pong, a friendly game of ping pong, but there can be bowling balls being rolled at you underneath.
Mm.
And but that's part of learning to use your attention. You become aware at how both things are going on at once,
Right.
and then you have a choice as to how you're going to respond to it.
Mm-hmm.
When I was younger, I always used to, point out the bowling balls, and that would get people very angry because people who are actually trying to bowl you over don't want to be caught out doing it.
Right. Right.
So, and then as I got older, I stopped doing that and just would politely exit.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I got it. Yeah, that seems like a good pause point on that particular track. Um, I'm curious, this is just me now, and this is not some anonymous viewer. I'm curious if you could describe what dynamics you're present to in almost any kind of relationship, daily relationship that any of us would have with our intimate others, with our family, with our neighbors, with our coworkers, and so on. I'm curious if there's something in the energetics or in the non-ordinary realm that you could speak about with regard to I think what the word I use most often for this entire area topic of conversation is trust. How do we establish it now? It seems very different in my experience. It seems like it's been shredded. The elements that I would
Mm-hmm.
normally consider important to keep in play and engage with and compare notes with, compare experience with my intimate others to be sure that we are on a page that's close enough that we can somehow have a bit of trust with each other. And I think much of that, as no matter how good a family or an intimate couple is at having trust, I think everybody's stretched now, if not completely obliterated, in terms of those
Mm-hmm.
elements and discerning them
Mm-hmm.
and articulating them and putting them back into play and when after they've been knocked away. So that I'm
Mm-hmm.
giving you a little bit of a sense of what I'm present to, and I'm curious, how would you describe the element we often call trust between each
Okay.
other, and how's it
First,
going these days? Yeah.
tell me uh, what trust means to you personally.
Yeah.
What is trust?
Trust seems to be most present for me when I get a sense that there's a shared coherence. There's a coherence in my system that I can, could articulate or I'm aware of, and there's some amount of coherence in the other person's system. They're not identical by any stretch, but there is some amount of this stuff called coherence.
Yeah.
And
What is that stuff?
that stuff is that there's a when I have that sense of coherence in my own system, I am present to a an ease or a flow in my system so that my body is at a comparable level of, a certain amount of ambient tension, certain amount of pleasure, certain amount of discomfort because I need to shift where I'm sitting. But basically, there's an ambient uh, comfort or familiarity in
So
each.
you
Mhm.
feel like you're home and you can take off your armor and
Oh yeah.
put down your sword.
Oh, definitely that. Definitely that.
Yeah.
I should have started with
And
that.
yeah. Okay. And then you feel what? There's a commonality of purpose and understanding between the two of you.
Yeah, well, there's a few things that make up that. One is that I love that you brought that up about so we're not armored up, either of us, or if we are, it's within a tolerance level that we can still exchange. We can still know I'm here, you're there, I want to be here, and I'm deploying my attention in a way that is warm attention and it's open, and vice versa. There's a critical mass of that going on.
Okay. So are you asking me how we rebuild trust?
Yeah, because I get experience that it's been thrashed at a huge scale.
Well, you can't build trust alone. Two people or a group can build trust,
Hmm.
but you can't do anything alone. If you meet someone and they're very distrustful of you, uh, you can actually drop your judgment because trust is really about judgment. You're constantly making a judgment. I described it as basically three styles of perceiving the world. There's the watcher or the observer, and then there's the judger, and it's good and bad judgment. It's
Hmm.
like, I love this ice cream, or I
Right.
really,
Hmm.
I hate uh, this broccoli or whatever, and but it's judgment. So there's the watcher, the judger, and then there's the paranoid. The paranoid is the judger who's been triggered into reaction and trying to figure out and usually making up the causes of what's making him or her really frightened. In other words,
Hmm.
you let's say you meet someone new and you decide that person is really the devil, and so then you become very frightened, and then you have all kinds of fantasies about what he or she is trying to get you to do or trying to manipulate you.
Hmm.
So really, whether you trust that person or not depends if you could find your way back to the watcher. Now, as a watcher, without making a judgment, you might realize there's no way to engage that person at an open level that you would call trust.
Hmm.
Uh, so, from my point of view, I don't persist. Uh, so, in other words, that person has to come in there with the same desire for trust and with the same capacity to be a watcher, a non judgmental viewer, perceiver of the
Hmm.
situation, and engage with you that way. So if the world is now running around in mainly a judgment and paranoid state, and attributing all kinds of evil and bad intent to others, and you meet someone like that, and you say, well, why doesn't he trust me? Well, it has nothing to do with you, uh, because he's usually or she is usually reading signs into you. So you can have even an intimate relationship. For instance, a husband comes home and he's 10 minutes late. If she really trusts him and he says, I was held up at the office, no, he didn't, or if she doesn't really trust him, she might think, where did he stop for those 10 minutes? What was he doing? And, but trust in that sense is, requires for me to read into that person that there's a certain level in which they are meeting me directly and openly,
Mm-hmm.
without deceit.
Mm-hmm.
And now, if I think someone like there are certain things I can say in, let's say, my marriage of the last 42 years,
Mm-hmm.
uh, you know, there's a certain way my wife, who had been an investigative journalist, uh, never trusts what someone tells her the first time. She had a lot of experience of
Mm-hmm.
interviewing politicians,
Mm-hmm.
and she always found that if you ask, you keep coming back to the question 3 or 4 or 5 times,
Yeah.
that the answer shifts. So she is always looking for that shift. So she
Yes.
comes in with a certain kind of judgment about how people respond and what they do and what they tell you. And until she would stop doing that and trust her own direct perception,
Yeah.
uh, she'll just keep doing it. So what do I do? What I have to do is recognize what she's doing, let her do it, and she'll get to the end of it eventually, and then we'll move on from there. Uh, but it affects me not very much because she doesn't do it to me a lot. But try to she will hire someone. She hired someone to fix something on the roof, and that poor bastard, he must have thought he was a politician being grilled by a journalist,
Right.
because he was.
Yes, he was. Right. Right. Yeah.
uh, and but trust requires, uh, for instance, I trust that even when she does that with me, she's going to do it to a point, and then she'll somehow satisfy herself, whatever it is
Mm.
that makes her feel, okay, I got to the end of this. I got to the bottom of it. That's really where an investigative journalist is always trying to get to the bottom of things.
Mm.
And uh, my knowing that, I just have to let it happen and watch it. And sometimes, frankly, it's a pain in the ass because
Right.
it goes on much longer than it needs to. Because the first answer I gave her was the answer that it is in the end, because that was the answer.
Mm-hmm.
But it's just something so ingrained in her because
Mm-hmm.
she was cast into, by the time she was 23, she was doing investigative journalism for the National Newspaper of Australia.
Mm.
And it became so much a part of her persona, and it probably plugs into her background as well, uh, growing up in a pretty dysfunctional family.
Right on. Wow. That was that's you covered a lot of ground that I have a feeling next time we get together, I'd like to do more of the intimate relationship level of
Mm-hmm.
that kind of coordination or mutual understanding of what are the limits, what is the bottom, what does it take me to get there, and so on and so on. So we'll
For me, just a summary, we can pick it up next time, is I see people in essence, their essence.
yes,
And I hang out with people if I like the essence.
yeah,
If I don't like the essence, I don't hang out with them. That's just how it works. So certainly the person I chose to be my life partner, I really like her essence.
mm,
And my first task always in a dispute is to make put my attention on her essence and therefore remember what she is in essence.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll talk about what essence is and all that on another time. But
Yeah.
once I do that, I you automatically, once you know how to do that, you reconnect to the person, and uh, you only can land up in a situation of real intimacy, because if you recognize someone for their true essence and you appreciate that essence,
Mm-hmm.
then that person will always know that they're deeply appreciated.
Yes. Yes. Got it. We are definitely going to cover that in future
Okay.
conversations, because there's a lot of rich territory there. I can just feel it. I'm curious if you have an experience of a collective. I shouldn't I shouldn't use this same word that you're just using for individuals, but I don't know what else to call it right now. An essence for larger numbers of people. Um,
Yeah, groups create an essence. They do.
can you speak to that?
Group.
How does that
Yeah,
happen? And
I remember when I was deep in Buddhist practice with a Tibetan teacher, and there were mainly Westerners attending this lamasery. That was there was a fellow who was brought out. He fled eastern Tibet as the Chinese took over. He'd been the abbot of Golog Monastery in eastern Tibet, and he was brought out to Berkeley, California, by a bunch of people with money, because they saw it as an opportunity to have this very developed Buddhist teacher.
mm,
And he, where was I going to go with this? He used to do these. I sort of was accepted as a student, and I attend these group sort of practice events. Some of them were meditation, but really there was one where we were walking in a circle and chanting together. So everyone was, their consciousness was focused that way on the sound of the chanting and on the purpose of what we were doing.
mm,
So the intentionality of the group was fairly well aligned. And what happened at a certain point, the whole thing created a kind of energetic column that emanated from the group
mm,
upward. I wasn't looking up, but I could actually perceive it, and we maintained that as a group. And
right.
when the practice was brought to an end, when he signaled an end to it, that disappeared and was no longer in the room. And then you could get the individual kind of essence, energetic qualities of each individual who was in the room. But when that was going on, that individual, those individual essences melded into a kind of a single thing,
Mm,
that was a very strong energetic intent that even formed what seemed to be a column of energy.
right.
And it's one of the things I liked about these practices. They did things like that. But in the end, I kind of decided they're really interesting. And that was, I'm glad I did it, but it was not of that much interest to me.
Got it. I'm wondering if you wouldn't mind spending a few moments more here in this idea of a collectively generated essence, or and it sounds like it emanates. It's something that you can actually
Yeah,
perceive.
an intentionality. It's a
Yeah,
group intentionality where the whole the energetics of each person becomes aligned into this single activity or purpose, or in
right.
a single intentionality.
Can you whether it's about that group or any other group that you've kind of gotten that sense of a remarkable level of that intentionality. Can you offer us some of the words you might use to describe, or you've heard yourself describe, that kind of collective essence or intentionality? I'm not really clear. I got it about an energetic construct, if you will, something that this pillar was something that you could actually get a sense of. And but I'm curious, what other attributes, what other descriptors have you used to describe that kind of a intentionality that you're aware of in a group?
Uh, I just call it a group intent or a group intentionality.
Mm,
I've never really talked about it that much. So
okay.
trying to think, what is it that's missing for you? What are you looking for here? Because I'm not really sure what you're asking,
Sure.
because I
I
just used a bunch of words
mhm.
to describe it, and then you're saying, well, what words do you use to describe it?
Yeah, well,
And
the only thing that I got in terms of something that I can say, oh, well, that's interesting. Peters was he was very aware of this is more than just a bunch of individuals doing an exercise or a practice. This was actually what's the word I'm looking for? A coalescence of the
Mhm.
individual essences, and it became something of a group essence. And the only thing that I really heard is in terms of a descriptor was this energetic form that you were present to, you were aware of. And I guess other questions I could ask is like, is there a feeling tone in it? Are there is
Oh
there
yeah, there's definitely, well, the feeling tone is just like power.
hmm,
Uh, it's a kind of a manifested power of the group.
mhm,
That's another term I would use for it.
okay.
And you could also say the January 6th mob had a collective power together,
Yes,
not nearly as coherent,
right.
not nearly as and also uh, it was like a quiet, peaceful power, but it was still power. I would say if it made a noise, it was like a great transformer humming.
Humming,
You
yeah.
know,
Hmm.
yeah, but there was no hum. Except for the sound of our chanting. That
Yeah,
was the only sound around.
yeah.
But if I was to give it, it, you know, I don't know if you've ever been near one of these big substation
Oh, yeah. Oh,
transformers.
heck yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, yeah, and you almost can feel the vibration of the field in the air if you get close enough.
Absolutely.
And so it's like that, but it's not physically that. It
Uh,
has that quality of being near something much more bigger and more powerful than yourself,
hmm.
but it's not like a physical thing
Yeah,
that way.
really
So,
clear.
that's the danger of using metaphoric language. People, take the metaphors literally. And I don't want people to take the metaphors literally. I want
Yeah.
them to recognize it's a metaphor because it's saying it's like something, but it's not that
Yes.
something.
Yes. Yes. Wow. There's a particular clarity that's been present in my experience in our conversation today. It's so helpful for me um, to just have more of a sense of yeah, just clarity in my own system as I'm listening with you. And because it's it's such an extraordinary time to be alive, and the some of the topics we're talking about are very, very different and far more intense now than even 5 years ago, not to mention 20 or 40 years ago. And so to be able to explore these threads, and to bring them to such a level of clarity, it's just really helpful for me. It's one of those things that can really slice through that tsunami of distraction and that, constant saturation of the chaos.
Well, I should emphasize again, it really helps if you pull your attention off a lot of the sources of that chaos. You don't go to mass rallies. You don't let your feed, just drive your day and your attention. You basically sign out a lot of those things.
Yes.
Which means you have to dwell with yourself more. And that takes a whole lot of learning to learn how to do, and to not be kind of frightened of what you discover in yourself.
Yeah.
And that's another thing we should talk about at another time.
Be more than happy
how to dwell in yourself and the value of it, and how not to let it disturb you.
Yeah, beautiful. I look forward to that. Peter Nelson, thank you so much for spending this time once again and this exploration of, how does a seer see this extraordinary world we're living in right now. I really just so appreciate your touring us through your, I call it your neighborhood, your way of seeing and perceiving. And it's just always exquisite to spend time with you, because we don't talk nearly enough about music. I find you to be one of the most extraordinary. You have such a diverse musical taste, and I learn a tremendous amount every time we talk about that. So maybe we can touch into that next time as well. So I would appreciate
whatever you like. You're the guide.
Okay, I'll do it. I would ask that you just stay on for a moment, but as I sign off to the crowd who's watching, and once again, thank you.
You're very welcome, and look forward to seeing you again, Dean.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us in another episode of The Poetry of Predicament. This podcast is produced by Dean Walker and the Living Resilience Alliance. Living Resilience exists to offer transformative support and resources to the collapse-aware and collapse-acceptant communities around the world. Our sole purpose is to curate and offer coaching, support groups, courses, and events that assist people in expanding their core skills, competencies, and capacities for facing a troubled, predicament-laden, yet still ineffably miraculous world.